Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing well this week. We finally got some snow this week here in Indiana, which is a good thing for this New York boy. He likes singing it a little bit here and there, at least. But right now, here in the building, we are being bit by electric technical gremlins. So if the live stream cuts out for any reason, that is why. I am recording and will upload it later if again we get interrupted and cut out. This is week 13 of this series following the golden thread, where we've been following the redemptive story of what God is doing in his world from creation all the way through to new creation. We're still in the Old Testament. We have this week and one more week in the Old Testament. This week we're going to focus on the prophets and their role, their office of prophet and the role of prophet in Israel, and specifically their message of hope and of the new covenant. But before I get into that, I wanted to circle back to something because of a comment that was left on last week's stream by Amanda. Last week I had made the point that the promise of 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14, that if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven and heal their land. I made the point that that is a promise to Israel, not a promise to America. If we're going to incorporate that prayer, that promise into our lives, it's for us as a church, but not for us as a nation. And Amanda pointed out that maybe Jeremiah 29 is kind of a parallel to that, a more appropriate way of kind of looking at how we go about praying for our land. Jeremiah 29, the prophet tells the people to build homes, to live in them, to plant vineyards, to grow crops, to marry and be married, to prosper and grow. Don't shrink in size as a people, but grow and seek the good of the city that you're living in, because as it prospers, so you too will prosper. I think that is absolutely the right paradigm for us today. We don't just resign ourselves to the fact that America is not our true home, and so we don't care about it. No, we live here as sojourners at least, and so we seek the good of the city, of the nation that we live in. It's absolutely true. I love that passage. I love that paradigm for how we engage in our world. But still, we have to understand that Jeremiah was writing to Israelites living in Babylon in exile. And they're supposed to seek the good of that city, but that doesn't mean Babylon will ever transform itself into Jerusalem, right? So here, America will still be Babylon. We seek the good of this city, but it's still Babylon. It's not our true home, which is the heavenly Jerusalem. That's a great point, Amanda. I just would make that caveat still. Okay, so last week we talked about the splitting of the kingdom after Solomon and his son. There's a division between the northern 10 tribes and the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. They're divided, and they both head down a path of decline morally, religiously, in every way. The north proceeds more rapidly in decline. They have no good kings. And so they pretty quickly find themselves in the crosshairs of God's judgment. In 722 BC, they are conquered by the Assyrian Empire and taken into exile. The southern kingdom, Judah, is a little bit better. At least they have a few more good kings. Kings like Uzziah and Josiah, who lead nationwide revivals. And so their decline is less steep, but it's still prominent. And in 587, they find themselves conquered by the Babylonian Empire, who is taken over as the big kid on the block in the ancient Near East at that point. Jerusalem is razed, the temple, which is the center of, the people's religious life and even their corporate identity, is leveled. There's nothing left, and they're taken into captivity. During all this time, the prophets are incredibly active. When we talk about the prophets, you can divide the prophets into two camps. There's the non-writing prophets, like Samuel, Nathan. You could put Hannah in that camp, and others. And then there's the writing prophets. Amos, Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. You get the idea. The ones that we have in the Bible who wrote books or whose sermons, prophecies were collected into books. So the non-writing and the writing prophets. Among the non-writing prophets, kind of the two preeminent ones are Elijah and Elisha. You can also divide the writing prophets further into the pre-exilic prophets, those who are writing before the exile, the exilic prophets, who are writing obviously during the exile, and then the post-exilic prophets, writing after the return from exile. So in that pre-exilic camp, you've got Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, but there's a little bit of overlap because he sees the fall of Jerusalem. In the exilic camp, you've got Daniel and Ezekiel especially, and then the post-exilic, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So when you're thinking about the prophets, those kind of help you understand where they fit in the timeline of what is happening among the people of God and in the nation of Israel. The prophets were really God's covenant enforcers, his covenant prosecutors. They enforced the revelation of God, especially as it relates to the covenant at Mount Sinai, which was a national covenant. It had these stipulations. If you do these things, if you walk according to my law, then you will be blessed. And so the prophets are there reminding the people, this is what God promised. This is how we're supposed to walk. And if we don't, we will face consequences, punishment. So they're enforcing the covenant. They're prosecuting Israel for their sins. But there's a positive purpose to all this. They're calling the covenant community back to covenant faithfulness, back to obedience, and back to living in such a way that they will fulfill that promise to Abraham that Israel, his descendants, will be a light to the nations, that they will bless the nations. Amos is the first among the writing prophets, writing before the fall, about a generation before Israel's fall to Assyria. And those early pre-exilic prophets, they really do, focus on, calling out sin, calling for repentance, and promising judgment if Israel doesn't comply. After 587, when Jerusalem has been destroyed and Judah has gone into exile, the tone changes slightly. And they're not slightly, pretty dramatically actually. And the focus is on comfort and restoration. So you can see why there's that shift, right? They've experienced the punishment of God. Now, through the prophets, God is saying that's not the final chapter in the story. There's also comfort. Okay, pause there for just a second. Let me catch my breath. There's a couple things about the prophets that I think we ought to clear up a little bit. For us, I think reading the prophets can be difficult, challenging, because they speak so much about corporate sins, corporate blessings, corporate restoration. And we tend to think in terms of individuals. So when we read the prophets, we have to adopt their mindset and learn from them that God doesn't deal with us just as individuals, though he does deal with us as individuals, but he deals with us corporately as the people of God too. That's a major thing in the prophets. Also, the prophets, they're there and they're interpreting historical events for us. A swarm of locusts isn't just a swarm of locusts. It's God's judgment. And it's a way of him waking the people up and calling them to repentance. An Assyrian army isn't just an Assyrian army. It's the arm of the Lord that's about to spank us. So they're interpreting historical events in a theological way. Nowadays, when so-called prophets do that, it can be problematic. So Hurricane Katrina is seen as and some prophets must sin. Usually it's something like homosexuality or, sexual immorality of some kind, or abortion. That may be the case. I don't want to dismiss the fact that God is still operating, still judging, but we do not have the divine inspiration that the Old Testament prophet. They were speaking as the mouth of God. It's inspired, inerrant in the canon. Modern day prophets do not have that qualification. So we have to be careful when we interpret historical events like that. We may have just lost internet, but I'm going to keep going, recording here, and I'll upload it later. The final thing about the prophets is we often think of the prophets as predicting events that are going to happen. And it's really not so much as them predicting events as them promising events. Kind of like a judge. When a judge passes down a sentence and says you will spend 10 years of your life behind bars, he's not making a prediction, he's making a promise. This is what's going to happen as a result of what you've done. And so the prophets are making these divine promises. You have acted in such a way that you've broken covenant. This is how God is responding now. He's bringing in the Assyrians. He's bringing in the Babylonians. But that's not the end of the story. And so he promises, divine promise of restoration also. Okay, so there's some caveats, some qualifications about how we deal with the prophets, how we interact with the prophets. What was their message? What were they saying to the people? Well, as I've already alluded to, they were bringing an indictment. They were the covenant prosecutors. They often rehearsed Israel's history from, especially from the Exodus on. God brought you out of Egypt. He freed you from bondage. This is what he's done, and he's called you to be his own people. As such, you have these obligations to walk faithfully with him, to obey the law, to observe his Sabbaths, to worship him and to worship him only. And then they move into crimes, specific charges against God's people for breaking their covenant obligations. Usually the crimes against God are idolatry, worshiping foreign gods, or syncretism, blending the worship of other gods and the worship of Yahweh together. Greed is a major problem for Israel, and injustice, oppressing the poor, taking their land, not following God's commandments to release the land back to its original owners in the year of Jubilee, and other methods of oppression. And they were failing to keep the spirit of the law. The prophet people back to the law, spirit of the law. If you read the prophets, you might conclude that they have a less than positive outlook on formal religion in Israel. The sacrifices, the rituals, the feasts and things like that. For example, this is a pretty stark example. This is Amos chapter 5, verse 21. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs and the melody of your harps, I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos isn't the only one to say things like that. And it would be easy to conclude that there was kind of a new formless kind of religion that the prophets were calling the people to. Kind of like, spirituality in America that has no form to it. That's not what they were saying. These things were not bad, the sacrifices, the feasts, the worship, but they weren't enough either. Going through the formalities of religion is not what God was calling his people to, but to obedience. Obedience including sacrifices, but also to the weightier things like justice and mercy. And so the prophets are calling people back to obedience. These things especially circumcision and Sabbath obedience, well, we're seen kind of as identity markers. This is what makes us the people of God. And if we're the people of God, then we're assured of experiencing God's favor no matter what our corporate or our individual behavior. And the prophets are saying, no, no, no. You're not assured of God's favor. That is grace, but it requires obedience too. Okay, so they move from indictment into judgment for saying this is how God is going to respond. He's sending the Assyrians, he's sending the Babylonians to judge. Sometimes the prophets really wrestle with that and say, how could you, God? We're your people. How can you send the Babylonians? They're horrible. And God says, yes, I know they're horrible. I'm sending them. They're not doing it willingly as, objects of my wrath. So I'm going to judge them too, for what they do and the violence that they commit. But they're right now exercising my vengeance on my people. It's discipline. But beyond judgment, the prophets offer comfort. They offer the comfort that God will save his people. And I've said that I think every week, right? That is the theme of virtually every story of the Bible. God saves his people. Mercy triumphs over judgment. The comfort, this salvation, really comes in two, there's two different categories I think we need to pay attention to how this is going to roll out. The first is that God is promising a better new covenant with the people. This new covenant, that word only appears in Jeremiah chapter 31, but it's a major theme of the prophets, not just Jeremiah. So here's how Jeremiah describes this new covenant. It says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." This new covenant, it's new, so there's a level of discontinuity with the covenants that precede it, but there's also a level of continuity. What God is promising in the new covenant is a restoration of all the covenant blessings of the previous covenants. They're returning to the land. They're going to be reunited as one people of God again. So there's echoes of the Abrahamic covenant. The law of Moses will be written on their hearts. So there's the Mosaic covenant. And they're going to have a shepherd that will rule over them, like David did in the Davidic covenant. So there's a restoration of these covenant blessings. All these covenants are building on one another, and they culminate in this new covenant. And it's not like the other covenant. There's a level of discontinuity because the old covenant was broken. The new covenant, its key feature is that it cannot be broken. It's an everlasting covenant. Now, if you look back at those covenants that we've described, like the Mosaic and the Davidic, those were often described as eternal or everlasting covenants as well. And they are, in the sense that they're all rolled up and now fulfilled and culminating in the new covenant. God didn't break them. He didn't set them aside. He fulfills them, and he's fulfilling them in this brand new covenant. There's also, obviously, the return or the offering of forgiveness of sin that was preeminent in that passage that we just read. Not just forgiveness of sin, but a total reversal of sin. A reversal of the curse of sin, which is death. So the prophet Ezekiel has that great passage in Ezekiel 37 where the dry bones are brought back to life. The curse of death is undone because of the blessings of the new covenant. There's obviously a return that is promised from exile to restoration. They're brought back into the land, and they're restored. Now, there's hints through the prophets that the Exodus and the possession of the promised land weren't the culmination of God's promise. And so restoration to the land isn't the culmination of God's promise. The land is a shadow of a better land to come. So when you read Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, and he describes this temple and it's magnificent, you get the sense that this isn't a literal temple. He's pointing ahead to not just the restoration into the land, but of something final, something universal. Because out of this temple are flowing streams of life. This kind of language is picked up in the book of Hebrews. The people of Israel were longing, Abraham and others were longing for a better land, the new Jerusalem, new heavens, new earth, which is obviously culminates in Revelation chapter 21. So they're looking for not just a renewal as a part of the new covenant, not just a renewal to the land, but of all land, of the universe, new heavens, new earth, as God established his final rule. The part of the new covenant that is absolutely kind of stark in its newness is that there's no real talk of covenant stipulations. There isn't an if-then part of the new covenant, because God is taking upon himself to bring all of these things to fruition. I will do this. I will write the law on their hearts. I will restore them to the land. I will do what I've promised that I will do. It's on God, and he will not break his covenant. So as part of the salvation that the prophets offer and proclaim, there's the new covenant. There's also a new and better Moses that is on the horizon. The people find themselves again in captivity in Assyria, then Babylon, and kind of again under Persia. And if you're in captivity, you need a deliverer. The original deliverer was God through Moses. Now there's a promise of a new anointed one, a Messiah, which is what the word Christ means, anointed one. He would come from the lineage of David. So you get prophecies like Isaiah chapter 9, that unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government is going to be on his shoulders, and his name will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, Everlasting Father. All throughout Isaiah 11, a shoot is coming up from the stump of Jesse, and God's Spirit will be upon him, and he will lead his people. Jeremiah 23 speaks to this Messiah also. Jeremiah 23 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord is our righteousness." So this is this Messiah figure that is, God's anointed and will bring righteousness and justice and peace to God's people as he reigns over them. Alongside that person, there is a suffering servant figure, especially in the book of Isaiah and the latter half of the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 49, the suffering servant figure figures in prominently. Identifying the suffering servant is challenging, because at times God speaks of the suffering servant as though it is Israel. You, Israel, are my servant. You've suffered now. But that's not the end of the story. But at other times, the suffering servant is given to Israel to restore them and to build them up. This suffering servant, one of his key roles is to take on the sins of the people. And so this famous passage from Isaiah chapter 53. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. In Jewish theology, those two figures were separate. But what we see when we get to the New Testament is that these two chords are united in the person of Jesus. He unites these themes. The suffering servant, yes, was Israel, but Jesus is the true Israel. He's the Israel who, comes up out of Egypt as Israel did, who is tempted in the wilderness as Israel was, who is the seed of Abraham. The singular seed is what Paul highlights of Abraham, and so the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. As the true Israel, he suffers all these things for his people, taking on the sins, and he leads and rules over them. In Jesus, that golden thread, of new covenant, which is sealed in his blood, and Messiah and suffering servant are all bound and all brought together in fulfillment. I look forward to getting into the New Testament so we can see these things, and how the New Testament authors refer to them a little bit more clearly, maybe. One last point. I haven't highlighted this enough, and I feel bad about that. But all of these things that God is doing throughout Israel's history, he's doing out of love, yes, and amen, but for his glory. He calls the people out of Egypt and rescues them for his glory. He's with them and he delivers them from his enemies and their enemies over and over and over again. And he says, I'm doing this not for your sake, but for my glory. And when he sends punishment, he says, I'm doing this for my glory too. You've tarnished my reputation. Now I'm going to refine you. I'm sending you into exile because you've profaned my name, and I can't let that stand. And then when God rescues them and brings them out, the prophet Ezekiel says, I'm restoring you, but I want you to know it's not for your sake, but for my sake and the sake of my holy name. It's being tarnished again. People are looking at my people and saying, what has God done to them? So because of my concern for my glory, I restore you and I establish you again. I have to keep that theme of God's glory always preeminent in our mind. God does what he does for his glory. And so if he's going to bring renewal to us, it will be so that he is glorified. And I pray that I get to be a part of, that kind of a renewal in our day. That's all I have for today. Next week, we'll talk about what happened when the people did get restored physically to the land of Israel. Under Cyrus, the king of Persia, they're allowed to go back. And so we'll talk about what that happens when they rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Did that meet all of their expectations? And if not, why not? So that's next week. That'll be our last week in the Old Testament. And then we'll jump into the story of Jesus. Certainly not going verse by verse, not even chapter by chapter, but these big themes and big episodes in Jesus' life that help us understand how he is the yes and the amen to all of God's promises. All right. Have a great day. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and ask any prayer requests, anything like that. We'd love to minister in that way. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.